Hello, everybody. I'm Linda Rossner, Chair of Hollywood SMPTE. Welcome to our noon Hollywood SMPTE meeting on what are standards and patents and why are they important. We are thrilled to have Mo O'Rourke, our manager, as our moderator for this. And I will throw it over to Mo, but I just want to say thank you all for joining us. We really, really appreciate this. And we hope you have a wonderful session. Mo, I hand it over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to start my video somehow. Here we go. There we go. Nope. Video's not working. But I'll start the introductions. We have Thomas, Bruce, and Janan that are here today. Thomas is our SMPTE's Director of Standards, and Bruce is our SMPTE's Standards Vice President, and Janan is our globally recognized expert in intellectual property and patent strategy. They're all going to help me help all of us understand standards. Why are they important, and patents, and how do they interchain with each other, and have a good time today. I'm going to start with Bruce. What are SMPTE standards?
What are SMPTE standards? Well, there's lots of jokey answers, but the good answer really is they are documents that we've written down where we've got literally hundreds of people to agree on a common way of doing things so that we make the world a slightly better place. So this might be, what number do you put in a computer file to represent the color white, if white is a color? Or, what number represents black? Or how do you put video down a pipe? How do you put video on an IP link? So all of these things, if you want to get two vendors to talk to each other, you need to write it down. And that's really what a standard is. It's a way of writing stuff down. And for anybody who, has trouble figuring out why you need a standard to do that, it's often easier to think about the opposite. What would the world be like if you didn't have standards? Just imagine that, nearly 90% of the world's population, they measure distances in meters and kilometers, and they weigh stuff in metric tons and kilograms. And apparently there are some countries in the world that use these crazy things called miles and pounds and quarts. I mean, the world would be just a weird and strange place if you had to live like that.
Good answers. Good answers. Thomas?
Hey, how are you doing?
Hello. I'm doing well. How are you? What's behind you? I see a giant coffee cup or
oh, the other way. There we go. It's the 5 liters of coffee I usually have in the morning.
Cool. Very cool. What are the criterias for creating a standards?
Well, if you want to create a standard, first of all, you have to have an idea about a certain technology, but you also need a need for interoperability. So that's really kind of the starting point, how you get into the standards. And then once you have that idea, you have to go out and find support. You want to get other industry players on the table because you want to have interoperability between different vendors, for example, right? And then with that, you can dive right into SMPTE, come to us with your proposal. You can have a presentation to our standards committee, to our technical experts, to get a feeling how receptive the people are to these standards or your idea. And then you can also see if you can find more support. And once you got that, and you have people together, and you have resources who can actually work on a standard, then you can submit what we call a new project form, and that gets reviewed and approved, and then you can go and work on your standard.
Nice, nice. Janan, do standards and patents coexist? Do you have to have one with the other?
They don't have to work together, but you can have them coexist. Patents are amazing. They're inventive solutions to problems that when you write them down, much like standards, when you write down your invention and submit it and it's approved by the patent office, you have an asset. It's usually some of the most valuable assets in any company are its intellectual property assets. And patents give you the right to exclude others from making, using, or selling the claimed invention in the country. You have to file them country by country,
Oh,
but they can coexist with standards in that patents provide for these exclusive rights, but standards, right, they want to be collective or provide for everyone to have access. You don't have to give up your patent rights for patents to have essential claims that are covered by a standard, but you do have to license them at reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, or RAND terms. So you have to kind of share, but you get some compensation. You may commit them for free, but are not obligated to.
nice, nice. Bruce, when it comes to SMPTE standards, is it just for hardware and or is there software? And I mean, Mr. MXF, tell us more.
Yeah, traditionally, in fact, it's just before answering the question directly, it's worth just looking at the technology shifts in our media space. Because if you go back, back to the 80s, we were struggling against the laws of physics just to get standard definition from America to the UK. It was really hard to do. And then as semiconductor technologies got better, we were able to move faster signals along bits of wire, along fiber optics. We launched a whole bunch of satellites. So we had more fat pipes to move stuff. And the semiconductors were getting better as well until about, I don't know, the mid 90s, when suddenly it was within the cost realm of a medium-sized company to design their own chip using things called field programmable gate arrays, of which there is so much IPR and so many patents that really you don't want to go in there unless, you're Janan, because actually that's a revenue opportunity for your company. And so in the 90s, we were making custom hardware, but that was the only way to move stuff around. But towards the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, software or CPUs were getting fast enough to be able to process standard definition TV in real time. And they could just about process high definition TV if you had a small power station and lots of cooling. Until, you keep following these migrations of technology until about 5 years ago, when there was this small shopping company, or what were they called? Amazon, that was them, who took this idea of selling commodity software and just making bandwidth effectively available to everyone and computing available to everyone. And now, if you were doing, just a random thing like a sporting event in Japan, for example, in 8K, you could still process all of that stuff just about in real time and get it everywhere in the world via these huge, massive computing things using only software. So one of the reasons why SMPTE itself has been quite focused on hardware standards was because up until about 5 years ago, trying to plug bits of kit together was really all about plugging hardware together. Whereas if you look at what's happened since COVID, everyone's gone virtual. Zoom has become the most joyous thing we get to do in a day, maybe. And a lot of the way that we process media, even live media, is now software. And to be perfectly honest, the standards companies haven't really kept up. Whether it's SMPTE or ISO or the IEC or, pick one of 1,000 different standards organizations, even standards organizations like the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, their software, and IETF, in a large extent, that their working methodologies have been like all the other standards organizations, which are really quite militaristic and hardware oriented. So that was a really long, rambling way of saying, yes, software.
Yes, software.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, what about, and anyone jump in on this one, the difference between standards and best practice? How are they connected?
Do you want to forget that, Thomas, or do you want me to leave you?
Yeah, I mean, standards, if you look at other groups who are doing specification, you have trade organizations who have some financial interest. You have special interest groups who work at very focused technology issues. Standards are a broader, I think, in that respect. They have more global scope. SMPTE has a global scope, for example. Not saying that trade organization couldn't have a global scope, but usually, and the other thing which comes with standards is, as Jinan pointed out, there's a legal aspect to it. It gives you a sort of legal security in terms of license terms, the rent agreement. So standards are a different animal than specifications, which are more loose, I would say. But I'm sure Bruce has something to add to this.
Me have opinions? How dare you? I was just going to throw in the open source mix here as well, and I'll feed you a question in a second, Jinan. Is that open source as a popular tool in media is relatively new. There have been open source projects around the place, but maybe, most people watching this will be probably using the Zoom client, but they might be watching it in a browser. And if you think about how this video is actually getting to your eyeballs, well, there's a standard for the actual sampling of the video. What is white, what is dark, how do the colors represented? So that's, dates back to the 1920s when the first CIE labs standardized, how to split up color. There's standards for the data moving on the wires between the telcos, because I'm in the UK, most of you are in America. So there's probably 5 or 6 dozen standards just to get my video across all the different telco operators to a point where it can be relayed to your computer. There's internet standards to control the datagrams that are moving around the place. But if you're watching it in a browser, well, you've probably got a Zoom plugin. Well, that's not a standard. But there's best practice on how to write those plugins, because if you don't write it with best plugins, as soon as the Zoom plugin starts up, nothing else in your computer will run because it will grab all your resources and not work again. And actually, a lot of the components that feed into this infrastructure, a lot of those are based on open source code because they're hard to do, but people get together and do these things for the greater good. And what I'm starting to see is that we're getting standards for infrastructure because really there's huge commercial risk involved if somebody does something vastly different. So to mitigate that risk, people get together and make a standard so that they can do big investments and make big, heavy infrastructure. And then sitting on top of that, you have more, larger open source projects, which again, there's risk involved, but maybe less than doing the big infrastructure stuff. And then sitting on top of that, you've got these agile apps. And I remember just before COVID struck, somebody at a trade show said to me, "Oh, we don't need standards. We do everything in the cloud." And I was absolutely flummoxed and didn't know even how to respond to that. I was going to talk about IPR, but I thought that was dangerous. But Jinan, one of the things having you on this call is wonderful, is that we have in the standards world a certain view of IPR and trademarks and copyright and patent rules to try and stop people from behaving badly. How do you see the open source world making that better, worse, or just muddled?
Oh, it's a fair question. I have to say, you're making my face hurt from smiling. Like, you have a good sense of humor, Bruce. But no, it's a fair question. When I look at the sort of maybe the intersection of open source and standards and intellectual property rights, or IPR, they do have something in common, and that is they are about documentation of rights and agreements, really about making commercial impact or not with an innovation. And the greater the agreement and alignment, the greater the commercial impact can be. So standards obviously require perhaps the most agreement from one point of view. The open source community is a group of people who are collaborating around an agreement of common IPR, right? Open source does not mean there's no IP rights. It means that if there are rights along the base and improvements, those are contributed to the community because the community is advancing in some alignment. You may still have patent rights. Red Hat is a great example of that. They were acquired by IBM. They have thousands of patents, and yet they're built on open source, right? So they maintain some proprietary aspects of their software offerings through patents. Patents don't require that you keep it out of either of those groups, but it does provide that you have more independence if you choose to have it as a patent owner. And I like your comment about the evolution of technology through the standards applications or use of standards. Patents, in a way, help us learn from each other because it is an agreement from the inventor, the inventive entity, with the patent office in each country for a full disclosure, teaching others how to make and use the invention in exchange for these limited exclusive rights. And those can be covering software and hardware, as we've kind of touched on.
I'm going to interrupt here with a question, if that's okay. We have a couple. I'm going to start with the first one. This is from Jeff at Esports Circus, and he states, I know that the committees are mostly volunteer, but standards have to cost something. What is that cost and who pays the cost? Is it SMPTE or is it the manufacturers who benefit from the standards or both? Lastly, I know SMPTE usually owns the standards like the color bars, but does anybody else own part of it, like people and companies that are part of the committees? And I have a second question after that. Whoever wants to take that on.
Well, I mean, the SMPTE standards participation fee is really meant to support the organization of SMPTE. Similar to, let's say, open source groups who have companies supporting them and paying, let's say, for maintainers to maintain the source code, we need to cover our financial expenses to run the organization of SMPTE. And yes, it includes also my salary, so there is some interest there. It's really about that, and that's where these standards participation fees come from.
I'm going to ask the second question, if that's okay, unless anyone else wants to comment. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yep, I was just going to leap in there and say, SMPTE also sells its published documents. We sell them through the IEEE Explore site, and it's worth saying that there is considerable pressure on SMPTE to try and make those documents free, because the average developer nowadays, they've got like 11 monitors on this side of their face, typing away, doing stuff. And then on this side of their face, what they want is all the reference information, all the help documentation for the libraries, but they'd also like to have the standards available at one short Google search away. So there's a kind of a conflict here, and it's not just SMPTE that's in this interesting quandary. We'd like to make our standards free, but in current COVID times, we can't just do it because that would be, that's not healthy for SMPTE. So we're trying really hard to find ways to actually make the standards available to the community in a way that's low or zero cost, either through, I don't know, sponsoring a standard or getting certain standards out there for no cost, so that we increase the engagement with the standards. But at the same time, we have to ensure that, Thomas doesn't have to go and go begging on the streets for anything other than computing hardware. At least we want to get him to have a salary so he can at least eat at nights. And so there's this balance that all standards organizations are having at the moment, because the cost of distributing the documents that we own the copyright to has plummeted almost to zero. And there's now an expectation, if you can't find it in a 10-second Google search, it doesn't exist.
Mo?
Yeah.
I was going to say, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
I just wanted to add about who owns the standard. And SMPTE has a copyright on the standard. So as Bruce said, at the moment we're selling it. We're looking into can we make this free. But technology in the standards is not necessarily owned by SMPTE. if people develop a standard, and if there is somebody who has a patent, then we approach him and ask him to sign a patent statement, which establish RAND terms for the technology in those standards. So that at least, so while not all the technology in the standard may be free, at least it ensures you that if there's license fees, they're reasonably and non-discriminatory terms to implement that technology.
Thomas, have you ever had someone decline to contribute their patents to SMPTE standards?
Not in my lifetime. It's on my time at SMPTE. I'm with SMPTE now for 4 years almost. Nobody declined. There were people who declined to fill out our patent form, but that was because they claimed they didn't own any technology in the document. So no, not in my time.
It is worth saying that part of the rules that SMPTE has put forward, which kind of follow the rules that ANSI have made, and ANSI kind of follows the rules that ISO have made, establish a participation policy, which kind of puts IPR at the front. So at every meeting, we've got this missive that gets read out, which basically says, if you're participating in a due process SMPTE meeting, drafting a document of some kind, then if you are aware of any patent that might be infringed by any implementation of the technology being discussed in this meeting or related to this meeting, then you must make the committee aware of it now. So it's putting the personal onus on the contributing members to identify patents that they're aware of. Now, what we do with that, SMPTE at the end of the day is essentially a small publishing company that publishes standards. We're not some great evil overlord based in White Plains that controls the entire media industry. Just leave that hanging there. So at the end of the day, we're a small publishing company, and we don't have a police force. If we had a police force, Thomas, just pretend you're a policeman. You're on my right here. So yeah, so Thomas is it. We don't have a police force to enforce the standards, nor do we have a police force to enforce the patent policy. When we do have patent issues, they do tend to come down to two typically very large companies who have minor disagreement about the interpretation of some of the words in the standard. And very rapidly, that goes to those two companies going off and having a little bit of a quiet discussion at some high court or other in some country, depending on where they think they're going to win. But Jinan's probably much, much better at describing that than I am.
It's actually, while you were talking, Bruce, I remember there was actually one case, and that wasn't for a standards document, for an engineering document, but for what we call a registered disclosure document, where somebody, the owner of that document, refused to sign our patent form. But for RDDs, it's not mandatory to have this patent statement. So it was in a way fine.
It's kind of a challenging thing, though, isn't it? The larger the corporation, the less likely, and the larger their patent portfolio, the less likely any single engineer or employee is to know what's in the patent portfolio. Most companies don't know what their patent claims cover. When we talk about patent enforcement or even these standards, what we're really talking about are claims in the patent. That's kind of like your survey of property. What's the legal meets and bounds of the patent? So it may be perhaps more common than we wish that companies who are participating in the development of a standard don't have full awareness of what's in their own patent portfolios. What a challenge that must be.
I'm going to interrupt with two more questions. Brian Gaffney, our chair emeritus from SMPTE
Hi, Brian.
Hollywood. We love him. He said, "What is an RDD? Is this different than a SMPTE standard?" And I have another question I want to ask from Jim DeFilippis, a former chair of SMPTE and wonderful professional human being, also says you might explain the difference between an RDD and a standard, as well as RP and EG.
It's a lot of acronyms.
Boy, isn't it ever.
Do you want to do the documents, Thomas, and I'll leap into my baby, which is the public CD once you've done that.
Okay, yeah, sure. It's I think I opened that door. So
Yeah, dive through it, mate. Dive through it.
So we have engineering documents, which are typically standards in recommended practices and engineering guidelines. And then we have, let's call them non-engineering documents. And this is, for example, RDDs, registered disclosures documents. So for those, if you have, for example, a technology owner who has some technology who he wants to make, or he or she wants to make publicly available, then they can come to SMPTE and do this RDD, write down their technology, and it goes through a short review, and then SMPTE will publish it. So it's a disclosure of technology, really, to the industry. For engineering documents, what's different there is engineering documents go through a due process. So that involves balloting. We have what we call a final committee draft ballot, which is basically the biggest step to get through, where your document will be peer reviewed. People will comment on it. They will bring in whatever input they think should be in the document, and then the document will be adjusted. With an RDD, that is usually not the case. People can comment on an RDD, but the RDD owner is under no obligation to address those comments and resolve those comments. So there's a due process difference between the engineering documents and the RDDs. And what usually creates this long time period to create a standard is this due process. And Bruce had an idea how to make these documents accessible sooner. And I think he will enlighten us now.
Indeed. So SMPTE has been criticized for not being the zippiest, speediest, nimble body on the planet. Which is fair due. And the biggest problem is not necessarily the process. The biggest problem is actually trying to get dozens of smart people to agree on anything, really. And when you've got a difficult and complex piece of technology, let's just pick a random one, high dynamic range, for example, there's a lot of investment by a lot of big companies, a lot of smart people, and you're trying to get one common way of doing it. And that just takes time to try and get people to agree on stuff, particularly the fine detail and minutiae of what gets kept in the standard and what gets eliminated. So we looked at this, and then we looked at the open source community and figured out that actually one of the things that the SMPTE process was oriented towards was the hardware way of doing things, which is, you know, when you're building hardware, you have to commit a whole bunch of cash up front, and then you build a chip and you hope it comes back from the fab without it all just being a lump of silicon with nothing actually wiggling around. So you do all of your testing up front, and then you do your big commitment, and then hopefully everything's good at the back end. Whereas in software, you tend to do it the other way around. You tend to build a bit, test a bit, build a bit, test a bit, build another bit, have a better idea, go back, start again, pretend you didn't make any mistakes, and carry on. So we're trying to figure out, can we do something that's neither purely software, but neither hardware, but actually makes everything slightly better? And we came up with the observation that in the middle of our due process, we've got a phase called the committee draft. So this is where the people writing the document believe they've written enough for it to be, well, useful. Maybe not written enough to survive scrutiny by 200 experts, because our committees are typically between 100 and 200 people. But it looks good. And one of the things that you really want in software is at that stage, you want people to build it and test it and try it. So we came up with the idea of a public committee draft. And on a document by document basis, somebody putting some technology out there can say, hey, can we do the public committee draft process, please? And effectively, there's well, not really a loophole, but a design thing in our operations manual that says that the standards vice president at any stage in any document's process can choose, if it's the will of the committee, to make the document public. I didn't read the small print to figure out if that means I've got a giant target printed on, well, no, bigger target printed on my back that people can shoot at. It probably does. But basically it's on my head as the sort of, I don't know, the person running the standards wing to say, yep, this is good enough. I hope that no patent lawyer will find anything in it that will, look like a prime rack of beef to come and chew upon. I hope that there's nothing in there that's inflammatory or breaks trademark or any of that other stuff. And luckily I've been doing this long enough that I think I can probably spot something that's obvious and has a sign on it saying, danger, danger, danger. And so far, all the documents that we've put out into public CD, I think have been pretty good. And we've had some really useful comments come back. So basically, at exactly the midway point of the standards process, you can stick any SMPTE document out and have it freely available. That's free with a capital F, that 4-letter word that begins with F that accountants hate. You can have it out there so that people can comment on it, review it, build it, test it, and just check that what you've written down makes sense. And then at any time between like 1 week and 3 years, it can then come back into SMPTE and then finish its life cycle and continue to, well, make Thomas's life hell basically. But no, we all enjoy that.
Mo, we've got a few more questions. Is it okay if I ask them, or do you want to make?
I have 1 or 2 questions. I want to go back. So SMPTE's been around since 1916. Yeah. So we have a lot of standards. In patents, do they expire? So if you have, we have what, over 800, over 1,000, 3,000? How many standards do we have? And how long do they stay? 3,000?
No, 1,000.
1,000. So 1,000. And since 1960, what about if like there's like some sort of date that after 50 years, it can be free?
So standards never expire. So they can be around for a very long time. And especially actually, SMPTE is now 120 years old. I don't know. So 110, I think. So we have standards which are very, very old. But standards can be withdrawn. So if there's a concern that these standards harm the industry, then people can come forward and say this standard should disappear and should be withdrawn. What we usually do, standards get reviewed after they're being published. They get reviewed after 1 year after they're published, and then 5 years after they're published. We call that 1 or 5 year review. And then the group of experts reviews these documents and then decides if they need to be revised, updated, or if they can be stabilized. That means, they're not going to be reviewed anymore. So that's happens quite a bit, that we stabilize standards, and then they're not being reviewed, but they can be pulled out again. And if there's a need, you can update them again. But generally, they don't expire.
So if we saw something where it was, oh, this is outdated, we've got to change this, we've got to move on, or whatever that might be, does it have to be a SMPTE member or from some company that has a famous name to do this, or can anyone just write Bruce and say this has got to go?
Anybody can write Bruce, and
they do, and they do.
Your email address.
And I would encourage people to send Bruce.
oh, this line's getting all shaky. I'm sorry. It's like.
But everybody can appeal to SMPTE if they think there's an issue. So actually, we have a standards organization, and as an accredited standard organization, we have an obligation to provide a mechanism that people from the public can come to us and appeal to us if they think a standard is broken. If you want to work on the standard, if you want to revise it, then you have to be a SMPTE member. So to do the work, you have to be in SMPTE. But anybody can complain, so to say, and say, this doesn't work.
I like Bruce's analogy to software. We think about software development, how much that has changed. Agile development makes a lot of sense in software. It's funny, people from time to time ask me, why are patents covering software, or copyrights maybe shouldn't apply to software because they last for such a long time and software really changes more quickly. So I think it's a fair question to ask about being more agile. The patent office itself can take 3 to 5 years from the time you file for a patent application to approve it. Although there's a VIP, get to the front of the line, we affectionately refer to as fast track. If you are 65 and older, it is capital FREE to apply for that.
Wow.
So if you have a co-inventor who is older, it's a great way to be at the front of the line and make sure you have enforceable rights faster. But the patent system itself is trying to evolve as well. But 20 years is the maximum life from the filing date of a patent that you have those exclusive rights. So they're obviously not ongoing. Trademarks are, of course, and copyrights have a long life themselves, 75 to 125.
Challenge your answer there. Different countries have different patent laws and different implementations of patent laws. What does it mean, for example, if your patent expires in territory A, but not in territories B through Z?
It's a fair question. Under the Patent Cooperation Treaty, or PCT, there is a harmonization of sorts of the patent rules. Almost every country in the world is a member of the PCT. And so most of the patent rules are standardized or harmonized to a great degree. There may be a year or so that change pharma patents, and other patents may have extensions. If in the US you have FDA delays, that kind of thing, or the patent offices delay, they can extend the patent term. So you're right, it's not precise, but it's approximately the same country to country. The biggest difference is that not all countries examine patents in the same way. So while software patents are still very much possible to obtain in the US, European Patent Office has a different point of view on that. And it's much less likely, much less likely to obtain patent rights. So it's not only the term, it's how the interpretation of what may be patentable subject matter that can make the difference in different countries. Great question.
Oh, can I ask a question from the attendees? This is from Stu Langley, who's been incredibly patient. So I thank you, Stu. And he's asking, can IPR be used to drive participants towards a standard rather than developing non-standard solutions? And I've got more questions after that, so let's just start with that one.
Well, let me start with that one, because that's an interesting question, because you can interpret it two ways. If I'm an IPR holder for something that's essential, can I make a standard and force everybody to use my standard and therefore have a monopoly internationally? That is a completely valid question if I was so minded or smart enough to have such a standard. And in fact, the only way that SMPTE can say no to any project that's given to us is if it looks like it's not in the public interest. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to ask Janan to tell us what the phrase public interest means, because it's nothing to do with, is it interesting?
No, fair question. That's what lawyers fight about, Bruce. Of course, what does it mean? And I think it obviously subjectively it can vary, but the greater good, right? So if you're looking at a new standard that will transform the way that video production is made or transmitted, how to judge the public good, it's going to obviously affect a lot of companies that already participate under an existing or older standard. So a new standard could be terribly disruptive. My impression is that most of the time, standards don't like to be disruptive. Correct me if I'm stretching that too far, Bruce.
No, you're absolutely right. And if somebody was to come to SMPTE with something that was obviously looked like an evil genius master plan that was designed to get their patent to win the world, a complaint would probably appear from one of our members, and they would cite public interest. And at that point, I would take a really rapid step back. In fact, Thomas and I would be fighting for reverse gear to see who could get farthest away from this problem fast enough. And we'd have to call in legal experts to try and figure out whether or not they had a valid claim. And there have been threats like that in SMPTE before, and we've managed to talk people down from the precipice and point out that actually for most of the technology that comes through SMPTE, it's a bit like a telephone. You need at least 2 telephones before they're of any use whatsoever. And typically they'll be made by different people. And so nearly everything that comes through SMPTE, you need 2 or more organizations to actually make the ecosystem for which the patent can be used. And then the reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, or if we can persuade them, the free, reasonable and non-discriminatory terms get imposed. But of course, that's the patent holder's right to choose those terms.
It's kind of the choice, though. You have everyone licensing it for a very, very small amount, let's say not free, but very, very small. So you're taking kind of a micro royalty compared to a larger royalty for early adopters. And I think most of the time we wade into standards by ensuring that they make a commercial impact that's really positive. More people want them. When more people want the standard because it makes what we're creating and what we're producing more readily available and it's better, that seems like a good recipe for a standard and a patent owner to come together. And yet it raises this question of, are patents or standards having a chilling effect on creativity? Because normally on a patent point of view, we think the more inventive or differentiated, the more disruptive, the better the patent, the more valuable that can be in the longer term. But it may take the full life of the patent for that to be adopted as a standard. Too late. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting that if you look at an area where patents exist, but there's no standardization, we're in the era of the cloud. And there are a number of cloud providers to choose from. And you can write your software for any one of those cloud providers, but it's actually really rather difficult to write your software that runs equally on all cloud providers, because typically there's some secret sauce that makes your stuff run differently on those different clouds. And SMPTE has been approached by certain companies and individuals to say, couldn't we have some standardization between the clouds? And that's as easy as it sounds, because you have these monster companies and you're trying to find small things that you can write down that will be impactful, that tread around the IPR nightmare that is the secret sauce that these different Goliaths have. But the interesting thing is that the Goliaths themselves are actually interested in certain areas of trying to standardize, maybe simple things like, how do you describe a video file? Do you just need a file name, or do you need a file name and a resolution? Or, one of Jim's favorite things, a color space and a dynamic range, and and by the time you start to describe all the things that might be useful in production and post-production and distribution and versioning and OTT, and so that you can display it on a screen, suddenly you've got a megabyte worth of descriptors that you could put in there. And strangely, you're back to the beginning again, and no 2 people agree on what those things are, because nobody agrees what's useful. So there is, I love your phrase, balancing act, Jinan, because it's exactly that. Too much doesn't work. Not enough doesn't work. But somewhere in the middle is the Goldilocks zone of getting the right amount of standard and the right amount of IPR protection.
Mo, may I ask another question, or did you want to?
I was just going to step in and discuss do you guys think that standards stifle creativity? Jinan kind of stepped into that part of the conversation as well. Just curious how everyone feels, including Jim, who's muted over here.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to step on that question. It's
No.
I think it's a tension that exists, and a lot of people claim that the patent system does stifle creativity, but on the contrary, thank God for Thomas Jefferson setting our patent system in place, because it has stimulated invention and innovation over hundreds of years, because it requires this full and complete yet concise disclosure to teach others of ordinary skill how to make and use your invention. That's a great exchange. If we didn't have that and everyone had trade secret or proprietary things, it's a lot harder to build. You have to have, some serious competitive intelligence to do that. And yet, even more so, the patent data, which actually, when I started practicing patent law, was not searchable on the web. You had to go directly to the patent office. Even in the 90s, it's amazing to think about that, but it's really the late 90s and 2000 when it was uspto.gov, free searching, albeit with the interface that resembles DOS or something. But it's made it possible for people to see trends over time, literally how technology has been evolving and the pace at which it's changing. And that actually, I think, stimulates more innovation, creativity. That being said, most patents make no commercial impact because companies and people don't know how to use them. And you have to have collaboration to make that commercial impact, much like standards requires agreement, right? You need others to help you deploy and distribute to get the broadest market, even though you have exclusive rights. Usually the smaller companies disrupt and invent, and they're acquired by larger companies. We have seen this over and over with the likes of Google, Facebook. They make the acquisitions because others are inventing more rapidly. And then it gets distributed more broadly under those IP rights, under the patent rights. The bigger the company, the more valuable the rights, right?
Wow.
So I think it actually does motivate people to create because it's a great multiplier effect. They're important and valuable assets that small companies can really leverage to ensure that they get the attention of the big guys.
In fact, if I can just pull a real world example that's currently being debated, let's take the realm of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got lots of people generating lots of artificial intelligence training models, lots of people doing artificial intelligence research. And the more people that start doing it, the more they realize they can't exchange their models because the models are written in different languages, they're represented different ways, and there's people working in multiple different groups around the world trying to figure out how you exchange the training models. And those exchanges of models actually, people are discovering they need to be tweaked so that exchanging a video model needs slightly different standards to exchanging an audio model because it's domain specific, the things that you're trying to interchange. So you create something in this free-for-all world, and suddenly it reaches a critical size, and you discover that the only way you're going to cooperate is by writing down how you cooperate. And you might just, write your stuff down on paper airplanes and throw it into the void from the top of your castle. But that's got limited reach. And the standards world is there to try and disseminate this stuff. SMPTE standards, we are an accredited standards organization, which means that we can feed stuff into ISO, and ISO gets you to the globe. We're not aware that Elon Musk's put anything on Mars yet. So for the time being, we're just limited to this one planet that we're on. But pretty much you get something into SMPTE, and if it's got relevance in any country, anywhere on the planet, they can reference a SMPTE standard, and that's reach. And that means that by the time you've got your standard into something like SMPTE or IETF or W3C or ISO, what you've done is written down your big thing so that anybody on the planet can get at it. And that's powerful. And if that's stifling creativity, yeah, it stifles creativity.
I mean, I think there's always got to be a balance.
Yeah.
And I agree. Absolutely.
So Mo, I unmuted.
Yay.
There you go, Jim.
I would like to take that question and slightly swizzle it a bit in honor of the fact that the Olympics start in like 12 hours.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Think of it like athletic competitions. Imagine that you didn't publish the results of races or the scores, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, nobody would know what the past was. What is the fastest a human can run in a mile or a kilometer? And so therefore, patents provide that. They're like benchmarks, as Janan was saying, and they form this basis of, state of the art. Standards are a refinement of that, which, after people have mulled around and looked at it and implemented some things, sometimes they're proprietary, sometimes not, ideally the best of the best. It's kind of like the pebbles in the stream. They get ground down and we end up with nice, shiny, gems, and we standardize them. And then they do stay around for a while. And, today I would say most standards are already somewhat obsolete by the time they're approved. which is another challenge we found
Yeah.
in standards. But again, it leads to the creativity. I mean, we've just had this explosion. And I think, touching back on what Janan said, I mean, the access to this information on the internet means the more people involved, the more creative, the more they can move forward and innovate. So it's all to the good, although it's at times we question our efforts and that's
So
it.
Thomas,
That's
I think
time to
Jim's
retire
just
to the
asked us
bar.
to only standardize things that will turn into shiny, bright, shiny jewels. So we'll have to build
Very
the bright,
good.
shiny jewel detector at the input of
Very
our
good.
pipeline.
You know what? An interesting thing I didn't mention about our patent system, we did say it's country specific, but the US patent system is really based on global participation because the market in the United States has been so active and robust commercially. And the enforcement of the IPR, the patent rights, is more predictable or consistent than most other countries. And so there's more business certainty, more value in the assets, but about half of all the patents filed in the US every year come from outside.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to ask a question from Robert Welch because, again, he's been very patient. He's saying, would be good to have a chat about the number of interops that occur to ensure drafts are functional and viable by manufacturers, then feed back to the standards pre and post COVID, that is. Anyone want to address that, or is it just a comment?
Well,
We do
let me have a go
a
at that because I've been, oh, sorry, Thomas, off you go.
Go ahead, Bruce.
So I've been very involved in the IMF plug fests and partly involved in the 2110 plug fest. And I know that, Robert, you've lost a lot of hair in the 2110 plug fests because you've put so much effort in. And everybody's always agreed with everything that you've said, and it's always been love and kisses and nobody's ever disagreed. So that's the wonderful thing about plug fests. Not really. And the plug fests, I think, particularly the ones that Robert's been involved in, I've been involved in, have been absolutely vital to getting standards that really just work. Because if you get people testing in isolation and self-validating, people always say that their stuff's great. I mean, I've never done anything bad in my entire life, and all my work's brilliant. I know that. However, when it goes under public scrutiny with people, you might have 50 experts in a room and we're all interchanging content, and somebody points out that the subtitles that were meant to be rendered in the middle of the screen have appeared right across the middle of the face of the actor or actress. At that point, criticisms can be levied against the person who either wrote the spec or wrote the software. And typically, if you've got a room full of software people, it's the person that wrote the spec who is the scapegoat one who will pick up those things and try to fix it. And particularly in Robert's area of 2110 and the IMF area, we've developed quite a healthy interaction between finding an issue in the interpretation of a standard and then trying to figure out where the fix should take place. Because sometimes the fix should be in the standard because it's just wrong. But sometimes it's often because the language of the standard isn't quite clear. Most standards are written in English, sometimes French, but often developed by people for whom English is a second language. And the more flouncy and flowery language that you're tempted to put into your standard using, the subjunctive text because it makes you sound clever, actually makes it more obfuscated. There's a word that is a classic one, obfuscated for the poor foreign language person who's trying to read your standard. And so there's been some really good and healthy debates about where standards are lacking, where there are loopholes, where it's just not clear, and where people have just written bad software. And it's a very healthy debate. And I'd really love to try and find a way to do more of this plug festing, particularly in these economically, virtually challenged times. But at the moment, it's just really hard, because you get more done when there are people in a room and you can look them in the eye and stare them down and say, yep, hands up, it was me that wrote that bit and the standard's wrong.
I'd love to know, how do you get involved in plug fests?
So the plug fests are operated under SMPTE rules because you're dancing around the IPR minefield of actively changing IPR taking place in a room. So you have to sign a participation agreement normally. There's usually also some other confidentiality agreement because basically the inner workings of people's products are being discussed amongst competitors. when I stop talking, Janan can pick that one up and describe how interesting that can be if you're trying to write down a way to protect yourself against that sort of thing. And you're not supposed to accidentally form a cartel in the middle of these discussions as well. And the last thing that you want is the FCC phoning you up at midnight. Had that, didn't like it, so I'm not going to do that again. So you've got to be a SMPTE member. You've got to sign up to the rules to say that you'll play by the rules and keep the proceedings confidential. You will not record what you're doing. You will not take photographs and post them on Instagram or TikTok. Other sanctions I've had to do in my time, because this stuff is really serious. If you get it wrong, there are serious legal implications if you accidentally photograph the admin console of some competitor's product and put it on TikTok. That's not a good thing to do. So as long as you're sensible, join SMPTE, you can literally be in the room as the standard is developing in front of your eyeballs.
Thank you.
Create your patents before you go to that meeting.
So we have a question from Brian McCarty. Over 5 years ago, the SMPTE Cinema B-Chain Technology Report showed several standards as scientifically and acoustically incorrect. However, this SMPTE hasn't done any work to replace these standards, despite how reliant the cinema industry is to these audio standards. This is coming from him, not from me. You broke it, you should fix it. Is this the level of dedication? None of SMPTE none the SMPTE now has to the cinema business. I don't know if you want to address this or not.
An interesting way of phrasing the technology status of some of those documents. Everything ages, everything breaks. So I'll get that out there right away. If you open up the document for standards that are 50 years old, you'll discover that some of the perf standards that exist for films that are no longer used might not be technically accurate. And if you go to some of the archivists around the world, they will explain to you in minute detail over very long lunches how we should be opening up these 50-year-old standards and make them agree with these old film formats that are no longer being made. And that's fine. That's a good viewpoint to have. But SMPTE, what is SMPTE? SMPTE is just the members and the volunteers. And people will do work if you can get enough people in a room to do that work. And so, as I said earlier on, SMPTE can't say no if you get enough like-minded volunteers in a room to do the work. I have no powers of any kind whatsoever. The most important thing I can do is chair the standards committee meeting. And quite honestly, anybody who wants to take that away from me, look, I'll give you my home phone number. It's an easy thing to do. So we are just our members. And if there is something that is so fundamentally broken that the sky's going to fall in, I would have expected people to be beating a path to my door. It's not to say that all the standards are perfect. I am responsible for inflicting MXF on the world, and many people get in touch with me on a regular basis to tell me how wrong I was and how the standard is broken and needs fixing. But nobody who makes those complaints is willing to actually come on and join me and do the work to fix it, because there's a lot of work. And so people who care about fixing this, fix it. That's just the way the world is.
Yeah.
Oh, that killed the conversation.
I think it's a terrific answer, and I think it's a provocative question. So I appreciate the answer. I didn't know if anybody else wanted to address that or move on.
We live in the world we create, right?
Yes.
We all have power and authority to create. The challenge is alignment and agreement with others. It's the co-creation, the collaboration, and that's the work of the standards group. Welcome aboard.
So I was just going to leap in there because somebody's just actually pointed out in the chat that there is now a project to fix MXF for D Cinema, and this is personally, I think this is one of the really, really good projects that shows that when things do really need really need fixing, because it's been broken for a long time, people will step up to the plate. And fixing MXF for D Cinema has involved some really enthusiastic people reading 800-page standards, 3 of them, and looking for the differences in the word and the word or in multiple paragraphs between multiple versions of this document to try and figure out, literally, what on earth were the original designers thinking? What is it that the people in the field have actually implemented? And do either of those agree with what we actually want the world to be like for digital cinema in 2021? And it's an outstandingly good project that they put together. And because you don't want something of this magnitude to be controlled by 10 wise folks on a GitHub repository, this project's actually going to go out to public CD, so it'll be freely available. The GitHub repo will accept comments so that anybody in the industry who says, well, my product doesn't behave like that, and you can have your input into the process to say, well, if your cinema projector or your post-production suite or your whatever doesn't meet the rules that the experts agree, well, let us know what the rules should be. And SMPTE is a consensus body. And by the time the end result comes to a vote, we need to have twice as many yes votes as no votes for the document to proceed. And if we can't get that, we'll go back and we'll have another go. And I refer everyone to what I said right at the beginning of this was the hardest thing in the world is getting smart people to agree on stuff. And I'm just going to let that hang.
One other note that Jim DeFilippis, who also is one of the producers of this meeting with Mo and Eric Gazelle and Alan Sholnick, is what is the difference between a SMPTE standard, ANS standard, and ISO, IEC, and ITU standards?
So Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a different scope. It goes in various directions. So ANSI is a national for the US. Other countries have their own national body, standards body. Germany has DIN.
British Standards Institute.
Britain has BSI, right? So all these are nation bodies, and there's an organization under the UN, which is the ISO, where these nation bodies come together to write global standards. So as if you want to get involved in ISO, as Bruce said, you have to be accredited with a nation body. We are accredited with ANSI, the American one. And through ANSI, we can funnel our standards into ISO to make them global standards. So SMPTE per se, what we are doing is we're very much focused on media and entertainment. So ANSI and ISO are focused on much broader topics. So that's one differentiator. The question why you would take SMPTE standards and put them into ISO is a valid one. There is different countries who can't use, if they do national standardization work, can't use SMPTE standards legally, or because they are not SMPTE is not accredited or acknowledged by the local government. They can't use SMPTE standards in their local standardization efforts. So what they do, usually they revert back to ISO standards, and that's where SMPTE then puts its standards so they can actually be used for that.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth saying that America, especially in terms of television, is a bit weird. It's an outlier compared to most other countries, in that most countries have a national broadcaster that not necessarily reflects the voice of the government, although some countries are quite keen on that. But there's usually a national broadcaster who has a public service remit, so that you kind of reflect the culture of your country. America is structured somewhat differently, but the governments of countries very often will only put broadcasting standards in place that have international scope, so that they're not, again, accidentally forming cartels or little tiny groups and beholding themselves to some other vendor who might be a national broadcaster of a country that you're not friends with, for example. So SMPTE standards, it's very important for us to have that international heavy hitterness about us. I think that's a word, it is now, because outside the US, national broadcasters need to be able to refer to international standards to show that they're not creating like a parochial tiny little ecosystem for the country that they live in, Britain, unless they want to, of course.
Yeah, and I should also mention that SMPTE is actually the secretariat for ISO TC36, which is the cinematography technology committee in ISO. So we're the secretariat there, just because a lot of our digital cinema standards went to ISO, and we are very involved with ISO. Few people know that.
I didn't
And
know
I'm
that.
the secretary.
And you hardly ever complain about the workload, which is just wonderful and very generous of you, Thomas.
Yeah, I think they're a little neglected, and
Hey, Bruce, before we run out of time, I know you have some really cool videos. Would you take a moment to kind of plug yourself?
Yeah, I've put together a bunch of training videos called Bruce's Shorts, which try to explain just one thing about media technology. And you can find them at mrmxf.com/shorts. And I'm busy revamping my website to link to some other interesting videos I've put together. Like I did a short video called The Splidget, which explains how standards work and why it's good to have a standard, which I will post the link so that everybody who's joined the call can have a look at that one, because it's on YouTube, but unreferenced. And my goal really is to try and make the sometimes tedious process of low-level media technology just seem a little bit more relevant and a little bit more useful. And one of the things that I do with the current series is I farm out the work to students between the ages of 16 and 20 to either do the editing or be the presenter or do the subtitling and pay them for their time. I take whatever the minimum wage is in their country and multiply it by 2 or 3 and pay them for what they do, because they should be paid for their work, and to try and make certain that young people understand that the media world of tomorrow, if you understand just the creative side, you're useful. If you understand just the technology side, you're useful. But anybody who's expert in both, suddenly you're a new genius, and you're going to be making all the stuff that I'm going to be watching when I'm dribbling into my tea in my old people's home, which will be next year, I think.
Hey, Janan, do you do something like that? Do you have videos where you kind of go over what intellectual property and patents are and all that?
Yeah, there are some. I have a YouTube channel, Janan Glasgow George. Also, our patent data, some of it is free to access and review. Patentforecast.com. Think of your weather forecast, but patentforecast.com. And I'm always available for questions. My law practice is NEOIP. NEOIP.
Neo.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to all of you for coming together and going over all this stuff for us.
It's been fun.
Okay, are we going to close this out, or do you want to have any further discussion? I know people are needing to get back to their work lives.
I can smell cooking from downstairs. So
Okay.
although I love you all dearly, I smell food.
So with this, again, I want to thank our panelists and Mo, wonderful. Jim DeFilippis, always great to have you. One thing I just want to say, I think that this really talks about the importance of being a member of SMPTE and having a say and influence in these standards. Because people want to know, well, what does SMPTE do? And we are really out there to direct the industry so that there are standards, so people have guidelines. People are asking for the links for Bruce. Bruce, so you just sent them. Okay, great. So with this, I just want to thank everybody. This was terrific. I thank you all for taking time out of your lunch for joining us. I see there's some other questions, or no, I see there's just comments. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so have a wonderful day. Thank you all. Mo, we're going to need you to close the meeting because our tech guru, Chris, had to leave. And this will be sent, a link to this meeting will be sent to everybody again. And Mo, are you able to handle that?
I can do it. Ready? Enjoy your
Ready.
dinner, your lunch.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all from
Having me.
across